What's up, guys? Hope you're all nice. It's all Blakademik is in the house with me, your host, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan. Thank you very much for joining us once again. Now, on today's show, we're going to be discussing and having a chat about wealth and serious wealth and asking the question, should there be an expectancy on the richest and the wealthiest members of the Black community to give back, to donate, in particular to those most in need? A bit of context before we introduce our guests as well. When we say the wealthiest and the richest, we're not talking about rapper rich or athlete rich or even Hollywood rich. We're talking about billionaires or people that are on the trajectory, at least. That means that in a deal or two or in a year or two, they will be also part of that billionaire club. Now, with me today to have this discussion, I'm joined by Elaine Cunningham Walker, who's the founder and director of Everything Education. Her philanthropy is sponsoring a hunger and poverty project. So she does give back to the community, but doesn't think that it should be expected of her to give back to her community. I'm also joined by Gary Grant, who is a credit risk senior leader, but he does feel there should be an expectancy on the wealthiest to support the community they came from. I've got here Donald Earl Collins, who's joined us as well from Washington, D.C., or just outside Washington, D.C., who's a lecturer and an author. And he wrote a very interesting article for Al Jazeera titled Why I Don't Understand the Black Affluent Class. And finally, we have Jamila Mclooney, who is a financial coach and strategist for Black Wealth Financial, who believes that the community suffers when giving back is withheld or neglected. And I believe you're joining us from California. Is that correct? Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much to our American brothers and sisters joining us. We've not had any Americans on our show before, so thank you very much for joining us on It's All Blakademik. We're looking forward to getting into this. I purposely invited two Americans onto the show because I understand that there's a difference in attitude from the Black British community to wealth to the African American community to wealth as well. So I'm really interested in getting into that as well. Let me start off then by just asking you guys that question to start with. I'm going to start with Jamila to kick us off. Then you guys please follow up and give your answers. Do you feel that the people who are the rich, we're talking billionaires, and I think a lot of people don't actually understand the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. Do you think the billionaires, the Black billionaires that we have, should be expected to give back to the community?
I mean, I think the word expected is what's getting me with the question, because I don't think it should be an obligation or an expectation in the sense that they should. I think it's good. It would help. And I don't necessarily know if giving back, just, you mentioned like donating or just giving money. What is that for? What is it going towards? Like, I think the expectation should be removed, but I think that it would also of course, help, but what are we giving to? A lot of times, you can just give somebody something and the values miss. So what is the billionaire expected to give the money for? I think that's a better question to find out.
I don't think it should necessarily be a financial thing that we give back to the community. It can be in the form of tools or a trade or understanding. I mean, there's a saying that says you give a man a fish and then he eats for that night. But if you teach him how to fish, then he can feed, his family for centuries, as that goes. Because I think that, and this is why I always say, and I agree with Jamila in the fact that you don't necessarily, there should be no obligation to give back, because actually I worked hard to get where I am and I can give you the tools to also get to the same place as I am. But what you find is that in our community, there's an expectation that because you've made it, you have to just give out some kind of token, if that makes sense.
This is Donald Collins. I would say that the word expectation is a hard stop for me. I think it's more like a yes and no, that in a communal sense, yes, we should expect those who have a lot to try to give some of that in a way to the community so that the community can be uplifted. That is part of the history, at least for African Americans, in the U.S. in terms of our history, in terms of that, not necessarily expectation, but a stated sort of goal, actually, over the last, say, 50 to 100 years with millionaires, certainly, and certainly in some cases with billionaires. On the other hand, this is a capitalist system we operate in. And since we operate in a capitalist system, you can't absolutely obligate any individual to give back for any means, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate. You can do whatever the heck you want, really, right? But in terms of the larger goal of possibly racial uplift and eliminating poverty and those sorts of things, in a communal sense, yeah, you should have some expectation or maybe a moral obligation or ethical obligation, but in a capitalist society, you can't have the absolute expectation of this.
Gary, do you agree? We're talking about billionaires now, people that have money that can rival countries. If you have that amount of money, is it unfair of your community, in particular the parts of the community who are struggling and have the least, to expect them to say, you can give a lot and still be a billionaire and help out your community, or is that slightly unfair?
I think my view, I'd come at it from a slightly different perspective. So the way the question is asked is, should the community have an expectation on some individual that's healthy? My view is slightly different, and my view is that the individual should set an obligation or an expectation on themselves to contribute back to their community. And when you're talking about extreme wealth, we're talking about a billionaire, right? So as a billionaire, you don't all of a sudden become a billionaire. That happens over time, right? As you grow your wealth, as you build your businesses, etc., etc. And I think we're talking about as a Black people, as a Black community. I think we need to create a culture of community and a culture of giving back. So along that journey, the question that I would ask is, what was this individual then doing while they were growing their success? Were they actually giving back to the community at that point or not? Yeah. And also the perspective of the community on this individual. That there's a phrase that we throw around a lot in from the Caribbean: "You rich and switch." Is that the case? Is that what we're talking about? That someone does well and they switch and they withhold, they don't want to give back into their community, they don't feel obligated to do so? Or could it also be that the community have changed their perspective on this individual, and now they're putting a weight of expectation on them to give back because they're now wealthy? So I think there's a lot of different ways kind of to look at this.
What do you guys think the Black billionaires should be funding within the Black community? What are the sorts of things that, if you are a billionaire, if you don't think there should be an obligation to donate or to give or be philanthropic, my teeth in, what should they be funding in the community?
Well, I would say that at least on this side of the pond, we need to be dealing with things like K-12 education, everything from better physical plants, school buildings, to providing more scholarships for students to go to college, to textbooks, to more after-school programs, more around public health and public safety kinds of issues, supporting organizations and movements like Black Lives Matter, for instance. There are a whole plethora of things that the handfuls of Black billionaires, and that's the other thing to think about in terms of your question, Jordan, by the way, is the fact that we can talk about Black billionaires as much as we want, but there aren't thousands and thousands of Black billionaires. There may be a couple dozen, at least in the United States. So it's not a very large group we're talking about to begin with in terms of their wealth. And they'll also address the point that Gary made a second ago. If they earn their wealth a certain way, more than likely they've gotten used to exploiting labor in the process of doing so. So in terms of the expectation angle of this, I'm not so sure that we should really be, that, no matter how much pressure community puts on in terms of expecting the billionaire to give back, the truth is, if they're used to exploiting people, they're probably not less likely to give back in a way that would be satisfactory to a community in the first place.
Yeah, that's. I think that's a really good point there, Donald. And I think if I go back, and talk about culture, what we're building, who are we? What you've asked there, Jordan, is what should they be giving back to? So you've got an individual that's hugely successful. Do they have a pipeline? Are they creating, other successful individuals? Are they investing into, great ideas, businesses that have, that need someone to invest in them and come alongside them to train them in, financial management and that kind of thing. I think giving back, it kind of spans. It's got a very wide bandwidth, and there are so many different areas where we need, as Donald mentioned, there's not a huge amount of billionaires, but there's a huge amount of need in terms of leveling up. So there's a huge amount of work that actually needs to be done, I think.
When we say there aren't a lot of billionaires, I think we're using the United States, but there's quite a few billionaires in Africa, just because they don't state how much they earn. There are a few billionaires in Africa, but I want to go back to what the young man in Washington said about education. I think education is a vehicle that empowers the individual, and that there needs to be investment from our people into those things, and not mediocre education either. We need to be able to build leaders of the future. And I think that's really important, because there's no point giving back, just like Jamila said at the beginning, like, what are we giving back to? There's no point giving to a cause if you haven't been equipped to be able to handle that money and turn that money into millions and then into billions. And that all requires training. And I think investment by the billionaire in that respect shows that you're growing your community. People are becoming better by it. And I think that's how you can empower and strengthen your community. But just giving back for the sake of giving money, or you're not giving to a specific project, that's where I have the problem.
Just Elaine, what's the work that you're doing? So tell us a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I do, if I talk about the UK and the USA and Canada, is I help children from the Black community who wouldn't normally have had space to be able to go into these 30, 40,000 a year schools to win places in there via scholarships and bursaries. And the thing is, a lot of the time when you're dealing with parents, they don't even understand the system to be able to get into there. So I have to train parents to understand the system and to equip them to get their children into that place, so their children, when they finish that period, have a place at the table. In Africa, what I tend to do is I sponsor food projects and hunger projects, feed the hunger projects, because those are people who are in abject poverty. And I'm not doing it to get a name for myself. I'm doing it because those people need help. That's what I'm doing, and those are the kind of things that I do. But if I bring myself back to why I started the educational consultancy, it was because I realized that a lot of parents want the best for their children. They just don't understand how to get in the system. They don't understand how to be in the game, and I think that's part of our problem. We don't know how to be in the game. But if somebody like me has got the insider knowledge and that can help you get there, sometimes people don't want to do that. They'd rather have the latest ride or the latest whip. They don't want to be helped, our community. Some of them don't want to be helped. And so that's the kind of work that I do in empowering the community that way.
No, I think it's really interesting. It's like the exposure, right? That's what it seems like, what Elaine is talking about. Mm-hmm. Just really supplying the opportunity to know that these things are out there. When I was pre-med when I went to college, and I just wanted to be a doctor my whole life, but there was nobody who could, guide me, or, everything that I did to figure that out, I kind of did it on my own. Like, my mom was like, look, past the 6th grade, I can't help you. So you got to figure it out. And so I think, the programs, I was in science programs and different things where we would go to UCSD over the summer to learn these things, and the different programs that, I got the scholarships to go to because I wouldn't have been able, my parents wouldn't have been able to afford to send me there. But these were things that I randomly found out about, you know what I'm saying? Like, they weren't just presented and there for everybody. It was, so I think the exposure is very, very important. Of course, the education on all levels, like Elaine was saying, you could put the money back to the community, but if they don't know what to do with it, I think there's a saying, if you divide up all the wealth evenly amongst everybody in the world, it'd be only a short period of time before it would be back in the top 1%, because, you have to give them the tools to be able to know what to do with it. And I think the education, even like, I think it was Daryl, I think that's his name, what he was saying about public health, food and education, just education as a whole will be so important to just expose the community to different things so that they'll be aware and know. I went to college in DC, I went to Howard, and there was just stuff that engineers and just different things, computer science, stuff that I never had even considered, but being there and being exposed to it. But I was exposed 18, 19 years old. So I think, those younger communities, the programs, and just exposing them to what's out there and all the possibilities by giving back in that sense would be most beneficial.
Is there an issue, do you guys feel, with large parts of our Black community, our perception of what is successful, and we align success too much with wealth? So just before we started recording here, Elaine picked me up on the fact that over my shoulder there's a bottle of champagne. Now, I don't drink alcohol, but I'm not someone that is chasing wealth, but yet maybe subconsciously, because of how I've been brought up, my mindset is that, there you go, my mindset is that if I show on camera that there's a bottle of champagne that's not actually even that it's not even that expensive in the background, that may be seen as some form of success. Is that something that we feel is a wider problem within large parts of our community, that we align materialistic things with success?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think a lot of what Elaine was talking about earlier is vitally important, because if you've got, the young generation coming through, and they've never had the opportunity to see everything that they see is around their local community, and to take them out of that and give them the chance to kind of expand their vision and their view of what is actually possible, then what you tend to do with that is you give them something else to strive for, and it's not necessarily just the new car or the new trainers, which is the only things that they will normally see in their environment that they would attribute to someone who is doing well. And then, once you're able to see those things, then you're actually in a fortunate position, because now that's going to drive your decision making, and the things you actually get involved in, the people you get around. And when you start talking about getting around like-minded people, there has to be a shift, and that shift has to be seen as an investment by those who know, and those who can help to teach and train and educate, come alongside, and allow them to see that there is actually more.
I think the challenge also is that sometimes when you start moving into certain environments, the community then looks at you as a sellout. So, for example, the way that I speak, I'm told on a regular that my name is not Black enough, I don't sound Black enough. And that can be a bit of a hindrance for those of us who want to help raise our community. How can we help move the mindset? I love what you said, about exposing yourself, exposing people, the younger community. If I use my son, who's 16 as an example, now he's getting to the place where he's starting his own business. He's 16. He's starting his own business. He wants to empower younger boys that look up to him, to show them that, listen, you don't have to strive for the latest car. You can strive to be a counselor in your community, to create an impact in your community. You can strive, you've realized that maybe the dustbins are not collected properly, so there's a lot of waste in there. So you can apply for youth council and youth parliament and all of these kind of things. And these kind of things, like you rightly said, give us more insight and allow us to strive for bigger things and create more of an impact. When we create more of an impact, we then become influencers in society, not Instagram influencers, by the way. I'm talking about, influencers in society that create change.
So let me just ask on that point to you guys. Image gang is something that's often used as a phrase that comes up a lot within our community, which some people watching may not know what image gang is. Someone want to just first of all describe what image gang is and how dangerous it is for our young people to be buying into this idea of the aesthetic and linking that to success and wealth.
It's so, as we talk about this, it's so intertwining, and like there's so many levels and layers to this, because until the idolization of the rappers and the athletes kind of change, then I don't see how that aesthetic of, and I ask my clients all the time, would you rather look like money or actually have some money? And it just seems like, we're just programmed to look like it. We'll go get the fake bag or the fake jewelry. Like,
do you not understand that? But for some people who come from very impoverished backgrounds that maybe didn't have the trainers, didn't have the bag, couldn't go, buy the fancy car, the minute that they come into wealth, there's an element of, now I have that money, I want to try and almost relive my childhood pains through the fact that now I can afford those trainers, and I'm going to buy 15 pairs of the same trainers. You know what I mean? Do you have any kind of empathy or sympathy for people that maybe that's their rationale as to why they buy into image gang?
I mean, I get it. And I've even heard back to, they take it back to Africa, where we were kings and queens and had all the wealth and had all the jewelry and had everything. But, I still feel one of the wealthiest people I know, he buys his clothes at Walmart. I mean, you could never look at him and see what he has, but I think that's something that comes with growth and maturity, where you don't feel the need to impress or the need to show or to buy expensive things to show that you have it. Because usually the people who are doing that, they don't even have any money anyway. So, I mean,
it's true. And how do we impart that into our young black boys and girls that are so focused on athletes and hip hop culture? How do we impart to them that, listen, Mark Zuckerberg probably has 20 white t-shirts that cost $10 each or something around that. Do you know what I mean? How do we get that into those young people?
You are taking such an individualistic approach to trying to deal with a problem that is systemic, that affects literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Europe. And you're talking about this as if, okay, we just have to teach these people to change their mindset. We're in a system that basically promotes materialism for everybody, not just African Americans, not just African Caribbeans, not just Black Africans, but for everybody. And we're here talking about, we need to get them to stop focusing on buying trainers or on athletes. Okay, even if you do that, the system is so unfair, and there's so few people that can make it up to the top that, yes, we can change things and massage things in terms of allowing folks to understand, especially young people understand, that there's a place for, that they can change their mindset and try to do things that are a little bit more off the beaten path that will help them become more successful. But this issue is not just about individuals. We're trying to do systemic work here, and having this conversation about it's because our culture is so materialistic. No, we live in a capitalist society where everyone's materialistic. This should not even be a surprise. We're trying to deal with poverty. And poverty this isn't a culture of poverty. This is just plain old poverty, right? Zuckerberg buying 20 shirts, when Zuckerberg comes from a privileged background to begin with, why do I care what Zuckerberg does? Was he successful because he grew up in a project somewhere in some city somewhere and then all of a sudden struck it rich?
But listen to what you just said. He was surrounded by certain people, right? So if we get our kids to be surrounded by people with a different mindset, their mindset will change. I know a lot of very wealthy people who are not materialistic. You don't even know that they've got. My son was in a class with Sir Ian Fleming's grandchild, and for a long time I didn't even know that that was his grandchild until I went to their house, and I was just like, why are there so many 007 books in here? And he said, oh, my grandfather wrote them. They drove the most beat up car to school all the time, right? But they were old money, right? So I think that, yes, it is a systemic system, but it's also a mindset shift as well. When you surround yourself with certain people, let's look at the Black people that have made it. They've surrounded themselves by certain people. If you look at some of the guys who've gone through a system of scholarships into Eton, into Oxford, they have a very different mindset from the boys who've been raised. And these are boys that were taken from the projects. They were taken from council estates, and they have changed, and they've realized they've come into systems that they've not understood before, but they've learned very quickly, and they've said to themselves that if I'm to get ahead, there's certain things that I need to do. And I think that the sooner that we begin to introduce that, so for example, you get a lot of young boys saying, oh, it's because I am this way, that's why I can't get ahead. How can we change that language? We change that language, like Jamila said, by exposure. She was exposed to things at 18. But if you're exposed to things when you're younger, you begin to grow. It becomes part of your growth system. Let me give you an example of, I think it was Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg took his son to
he's a politician here in the UK, for those that don't know.
Yes, he's a politician in the UK. I'm sorry, I should have explained that. So he took his son, who was quite young, to his workplace, and so the boy begins to understand how politics works. We as a community don't tend to do that. We almost let our children raise themselves, and so we need, as parents, to begin to understand that, like Jamila said, her mum didn't go past a certain level in school. Okay, I don't know this, but I need to get you in touch with somebody who does know. Jamila, I'm sure, is not going to make that same mistake with her children. She's going to go, listen, I learned this when I was 18. I want you to learn this when you're 10.
I get what you're saying, but we're talking about an issue that's larger than just individuals. You can do, even if everybody's mindset changes literally at the same time, somehow magically, we all decide that we're going to take all these steps that everyone else who's already successful is doing. We live in a system that is so grossly unfair that the vast majority of people will not get access to these things. And those who do, that brings us right back to the question that Jordan asked us right from the beginning, Elaine, which is the question of, is there going to be an obligation to give back? There have been more and more Black Americans or American Blacks, African Blacks, Blacks in the UK and other parts of the world who have moved in the middle class and who have become successful. And they, generally speaking, aren't doing the things that you are suggesting that they do. So while you're talking about sort of this individualistic, incremental sort of kind of progress, the vast majority of people are not going to get that. And that's my concern with this conversation, that we're going into these sort of individualistic kinds of solutions, giving individualistic examples that work for you, that work for me, maybe work for Jamila, but isn't going to work for 20 million people or 40 million people or 100 million people.
What's the systemic solution, or what's your suggestion for that? Because I mean, you have to start somewhere. Elaine might not be able to reach all of the people, the 10 million that you're talking about, but each one teach one. You're starting somewhere. So if it's not individualistic where we should start, then what's the remedy?
Let me put that question towards Gary. I want a kind of slightly different question, but on that same track. Do you feel it's possible for Black people to be billionaires en masse in a capitalist society?
I think it's possible. I also do think it's still going to be a great challenge, because if the focus is, and I kind of have to swing back to what Donald is saying, because I hear what you're saying there, Donald, is that we're in a capitalist society, so everyone is striving for themselves or their own, right? That's not going to help us to get to where we really want to be, right? And I think it needs to be more of a cultural shift. It needs to be something that we are building together as a community. that everybody feeds into. You know, it's got to be about legacy. It's got to be about something that outlives our own individual lives that we're actually feeding into. So it's not just about my individual success, but it's more about what and how I'm giving back and what we're building as in unity as a community. And I think that's a big challenge to get to that point. But if we don't start moving it in that kind of direction, we will always lose. Yeah, because the system will always work against us. And if you stand back and look at the system is in place to work for those who it works for, right? So unless we build our own, we will never have our own. It will just be individuals that have. I remember reading an article the other day about the Jewish community, right? And they have a culture of giving. I mean, some of you might know far more about this than I do. But they have a culture of giving. It's embedded in their nature and how they operate. And in 2014, I mean, and they go about very different ways of how to give back into their communities. So they'll set up foundations and trusts and all sorts of stuff to find different methods of giving back. Now, that giving back covers a multitude of different things, right? I think 2014, the top 150 foundations must have raised 6.42 billion for these foundations. And at least 25% of that ended up back in the Jewish community for Jewish causes, right? So it can be done, but you have to embed it into your culture, into what, you know, and have a really long-term view of what you're actually trying to do. So having that as your culture, like I say, if you have that as your culture and you have an individual that's born into that culture, when they start, as Elaine was saying, at 16 years old, and they start their own business, the first £100 they make, they're giving 10% back into their community, right? So by the time they become a millionaire, it's not a problem. It's already in their mind. It's already in their mind process. It's part of their habits. By the time they get to a billionaire, we won't be having this conversation about should they be obligated or expected to give, because it's a habit.
So let me ask Jamila, is it then more so about then building billionaire mindsets rather than actual billionaires? Because is there anything, there's nothing wrong with being a billionaire, I suppose, in theory, but is it about the mindset of how we want to bring up our own community alongside us, those that are succeeding and doing well? So you may not ever own $1 billion or £1 billion, but is it now more so about building billionaire mindsets, which is more about community? It's more about we all are going to succeed, even if, you know, I'm just a millionaire and I own $1 million.
You know, I talk a lot about mindset, and I say in my consultations with my clients, like, it's very little to do with money. What I do is mindset shift around money, because depending on where you come from, what your experiences were with money, you have your own embedded feelings about that. So I think, you know, I think mindset is important. It just is. And if it can start there, again, with the exposure and just letting these kids know in the culture that they can have more. You don't have to be an athlete to do this. But if we get to, that's why I said I feel like there's so many layers to this, because if we're looking at the systemic issue, then I feel like we got to go to the parental structure and foundation of the homes and start. I mean, we have to go through so many things to even begin to unlearn and undo all of the things that have been taught. So we got to start somewhere, and what we can control and what we can expose everybody to on a mass exposure level is the mindset. I mean, we can do that faster than we can change a system that's built against, you know, the impoverished or our culture as a whole. So I don't want to discount the mindset. That's everything. Billion in your pocket or not, the mindset is everything. The foundation is.
I think you talk about the billionaire mindset, but it's also about what your child is watching as well. Or as an adult, what are you watching? There's a lot of children that don't even understand what interest rates are. They don't know what mortgages are. They don't know about stocks and shares. They don't watch any of these things, but they can tell you what happened in what's it, Top Boy or whatever, last week. They can tell you that.
Love Island.
You know, yeah. They can tell you all of that, but they can't tell you. They can't even tell you what's going on. The only time that I think everybody was aware that everything was going on was when George Floyd was killed. That's when everybody started talking about stuff. But after hashtag Black BLM is not trending as much, ask them what's going on in the world today. What's going on with the number of coronavirus cases? What's going on in the United States? What's going on in Brazil? They can't tell you because they're not watching those kind of things. They don't understand what current affairs is. And so when they get to 21 and they're dealing with people, they're in university, when they decide to go to university, and they're dealing with people who've been watching this and reading the newspaper from day dot and having conversations with their parents. And it goes back to what Jamila is saying, is there's so many layers to this, even the way we parent our children, the way we speak to our children. There are some people that are still trying to deal with the hurts with the language that was used by parents when they were children as grown-ups. And so they've then had children and they don't know how to remove that from who they are in order to parent effectively, if that makes sense. So it's like a serious cycle that's going on. And like, sorry, I don't mean to go on, Jordan, but like what the other guy was, I've forgotten your name, I'm so sorry, was talking about
Donald or Gary.
You know, when you Gary in the white shirt. Is that right. Gary? Yeah. So he was talking about when you give back at a young age, your first 100, it becomes an attitude, a lifestyle of giving back. I know that the Jewish community, the grandparents, when they are saving their money, they're actually saving their money for the education of their grandchildren. So if you notice, a Jewish person never has to worry about the education of their children. Right. We don't do that. It's a worry.
Let me just go to Donald for a second. Something in the article that you wrote on Al Jazeera I found interesting. A black middle class that cares more about civility and less about speaking out about structural racism and inequality is one that is difficult to understand. It makes them unwitting partners in white supremacy, patriarchy, and socioeconomic inequality. Just unpack that for us for a second, Donald.
Sure. All I'm saying here is this. The system is, this capitalist system is imperialistic, it's racist, it's misogynistic. It's a system that disadvantages you on the basis of all of those things. So if you are a white guy, you will most likely get ahead. If you are a black guy, you are less likely to get ahead. If you are a black woman, you are even less likely to get ahead than a black guy. Generally, that's the case. You know, any statistic in the U.S. in particular, but you know, really pretty much anywhere in the African diaspora tends to bear that out, right? So all I'm saying here is that when you think about advancing as individuals and even as a group into the middle class or into affluence, meaning you've got at least net worth of $250,000 a year in the case of the U.S., or become a millionaire, right? You have, in essence, become part of the system that while you might be doing well, there are plenty of other people who aren't. And as you become part of that system, there is a tendency to absorb all of the ideas and lessons from that system as well. Lessons that lead to things like giving, you know, like, say, the late Reginald Lewis, who used to own Tropicana Orange Juice, and Beatrice Foods, who gave $3 million to Harvard Law School in 1991, but nary a dime for black causes or black institutions, for instance, just as one example, right? So that's where I'm getting at. When you become successful in a system that is bent toward your lack of success, there's a tendency for most people to not change their mindset, as Jamila has talked about earlier, and saying, you know what, I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to try to help other people do what I just did. Or I'm going to do something even more radical and say, I'm going to challenge this system because, yes, I've made a lot of money out of this system. I've become wealthy as a result of using this system. I want to make sure that this system does not stay the way it is so that it's so hard for everyone else coming up at the same time. There are ways of doing that by supporting causes and supporting movements.
So let me ask you, Donald. Do you feel that community wealth can trump those systemic problems?
Yes and no. I mean, it massages at the edges a bit and takes the sharpest edges and just it sands them down a bit, right? But you're still operating in a system that, generally speaking, does not want you to succeed, right? So you can improve community situations. You know, individuals can give, communities can change. You know, people can change their mindset. But ultimately, there's only going to be so much room in the capitalist system for people to do well. Which means that while you might raise the boat, it's not going to change the whole scenario, if you will.
I think the first thing I would say is when Don was talking, and I was thinking, is this really where we are? Because basically what you're saying is the system, how would I put it? Correct me if I'm wrong in summing this up, yeah? The system removes our greatest potentials to become dormant for our future legacy.
More or less. I would say that it's not so much that it removes it, it just, there's the ceiling, right? And it's a ceiling that makes it hard. It just makes it hard for, even if you are doing really well, you know, there's only so much room because of systemic racism, because of systemic sexism, because of the combination of those things with poverty, right? There's only so many billionaires you can create out of this current system.
And let me ask you guys, I'll come to you, Jamila. I don't know if you know, there's something from the Caribbean, from Jamaica in particular, that used to happen way back in the day called partners. I don't know if you guys have heard of, you've heard of partners. For those that don't know what a partner is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was a system whereby everybody in the household or in the family all put into a pot of money, as little or as much as you could. So it could be $10 or £10 a week or a month, whatever. Yeah. And at the end of the month or end of the agreed date, one person in that family would then get that money, would take that money away, and then they had the money, and then that system would continue. That's a kind of basic definition of what a partner was. I've started a partner with my mum and brother in the last couple of months again, not because I want to be a billionaire, but just because I want us all to win. I want us all to be successful and comfortable financially to the point where we are comfortably nice. Is that the first step in trying to break down the huge monster of capitalism that Donald has been talking about, in terms of, you know, it might start with $10 a week, £10 a week, but that is going back to the mindset of how to bring everyone along with you and bring that economic power base up through your family, starting with 2 or 3 people.
I think that's a great point. I remember growing up speaking to my parents about that time when they came to the UK. If I set the scene, my parents came from Jamaica. When they came across to the UK, as far as they're concerned, you know, they've been called, they're coming to help the motherland, and when they got here, it was a completely different story. It was no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Couldn't find anywhere to live. No one would rent you a room. You know, they've got you doing rock bottom jobs, even though you're a professional and qualified. You would never be able to work in your field. So as Jordan was talking about the partner, they used the partner in order to pool their funds together, right? So that they could end up buying properties, right? So these guys came over, they were doing rock bottom jobs, but they had a community and they pooled in together, they raised funds and they started to buy properties. right? And there are many families around us that I know bought their first property by using the whole partner. By the time they got to their second and their third properties, they were paying for them cash. And they were
So why did we go away from that, Gary? Why or how did we go away from that? I mean, it's coming back a little bit now, but why did we go so far away from that? Because it was working.
I don't think our parents moved away from it. I think what ended up happening was it was something they'd never been through before, right? So when my parents were in Jamaica, they had kids in Jamaica, they sent them to school in Jamaica. When those guys were at school, my parents trusted the system. They trusted the teachers. They knew that everyone was working on behalf of their children and their family. If my brothers did anything wrong at school, they knew by the time they got home that mum and dad would know about it, and they would need to sort themselves out, right? So our parents come to England thinking that it's based on exactly the same system, the same values, the same principles, and they send their children to school having a trust in the school because it's based on the same system as they're coming from in Jamaica. But those schools didn't care about their children. Those schools were not set up for their children to succeed. They were set up for them to fail, right? So although our parents knew exactly what they were doing and they had their community, they didn't realize that their children who were growing up in a new space didn't have the learnings that they had. And because this was something they were going through for the first time, they didn't really know what lessons they had to pass on. They just got on with it. So then we get to a stage where the whole time that they're here, they're literally planning to go home. Right? Yes. That was their whole thing. I'm working so hard so that I can buy my land back home in Jamaica and build my house. So I can walk around my house. That's all they used to talk about. I need house and land. I can walk around. And I think everybody would have heard that phrase. I need house and land. Right? But although we saw what they did, we didn't understand how they went about it. And then us growing up behind them didn't have the same community structure. So we would have had church, etc., but we didn't have the same kind of network that they created. And I think I would say we became westernized in the whole process. So back to what Donald was saying as well, becoming a little bit more materialistic and not planning for future. Because my parents didn't buy anything unless they saved the money for it. Right? Whereas now you can go out and you can get a brand new car and pay 1 month.
I hear it. I just want to kind of just the final area I want to touch on is the current climate of which we're all living under, both here in the UK, the US, and globally, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm constantly thinking to myself, okay, what's going to be the outcome? What do we want to come from people respecting and valuing Black lives? And the point I keep coming back to, which I want to get all four of your answers briefly on, is the only way we're going to be respected and Black lives are going to be respected and valued is if we hold economic weight. And I'm not talking about necessarily billionaires now for a second, but until we hold economic power, institutions, governments, corporations will never truly not only not value Black lives, but they will never set up systems to allow us in and to allow us to run these organizations. Is economic power base the only way that Black Lives Matter is going to truly be viewed as successful?
I would start with, I'll give you a direct example of, someone who thought that this would work about 120 years ago by the name of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington told Black folks to cast their buckets where they were and to build an economic power base such that, that would basically be the entryway, the way to gain equality within the United States. Marcus Garvey sort of preached some of the same stuff when he founded the United Negro Improvement Association on the heels of Booker T. Washington in 1916 in New York. Both were sort of along those lines. And when Black folks started doing that, things like race riots broke out where white people burned down rich parts of towns like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And, and in Florida in 1923 with Rosewood and other places. So, economic power alone doesn't guarantee you anything in terms of the value of Black lives, right? Not to mention the fact, I mean, folks in the system already know that we're valuable. That's how they use us and exploit us in terms of like wealth and wealth generation and using ideas and using culture to make money off of. So, it's not a question of whether we have economic value, it's a question of how we somehow coalesce that value into movement, community building, all the other things that we've been talking about for the last 50 minutes.
Gary, what's the answer? How do we give me a solution as to how we, as Black people here in Britain, let's just start with our little island here in Britain. How can Black people here in the UK really get that kind of leverage that Elaine's talking about there, politically as well as in the boardroom and business?
I think I'd agree with what's just been said by both Donald and Elaine, and I think we need to pull together more. We need to support one another more. We obviously need to buy Black. We need to promote Black-owned businesses and allow those Black-owned businesses. And I think I'd always go back to what are we trying to build? We have to define it. And the whole economic power basically allows you to step into spheres of more influence, because, for instance, if as a community we're using the Black Pound in a way to promote and aid our own communities, then what happens is the system has to come to you to get a spokesperson for your community to understand what your needs are so that they can offer it to you. Because they don't want to be left out of that loop. So does it open the door of influence? Yes, it does, but we need to be really clear on what we're building. And it can't be just for the short term. It has to be for the long term. And it can't just be a case of us always asking for stuff and begging for things. We have to get ourselves in a position where we can make demands. And I think that does start with our spending power. I think that's where it begins. But everything that we've been talking about giving back into our community, investing in our community, educating our community, building our asset base as a community in terms of properties and business ownership, etc. I think all of these things are part of the same solution, but it all needs to be pulled together.
So just to bring it back to and to wrap up as well, the discussion here is wealth, Jamila. What is the one thing that you would like to see the Black community, let's start with in the States in America where you are, to ensure that we have more billionaires that are responsible and conscious, who actually want to give back to the community rather than, there being that expectancy on them to give back?
I think if, once some things are implemented and they could see the benefit, knowing that, colleges being taken care of, or businesses were started, or someone bought a home, or, something that is tangible that people can see based off of. Because I don't think a lot of times, like we had, Bob Johnson paid off the Morehouse student loans for their graduating class, but then what? So, okay, now they're in a position they don't have the debt, but was there anything put in place to know now how we avoid debt now moving forward? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the education piece, because it's easy to just throw some money at something to temporarily put a Band-Aid on it. But if we're not getting to the root, and finding out how we can eliminate and improve so that we don't run into this again, it's just, I don't know. We need more. We need more on just a foundation level, like, it's overwhelming because there are some good things being done. And I know a lot of the rappers and athletes are now talking about ownership and real estate and different things like that. But, they're not putting that in their music. So the kids are getting double messages. So we got to do more. And I just think starting, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer. I have no idea. But we got to do more. We got to do more with the handouts, more with the education, along with that, not just, here I donated this amount of money, but what after that, what am I going to do with this knowledge? Where can I call you if I have some questions? Is there an internship set up somewhere? Can I get some knowledge of what to do now that I've graduated college with no student loans? I mean, what do we do? I know a lot of, in our culture, a lot of my clients are first generation money, and there's a responsibility to help your mama and help your brother and help your niece and nephew and help all these people before they can even establish their own, foundation for their wealth. So it's just like we've got a lot to overcome, and I don't know where to start with it. I think there's a lot of good things in place. Elaine's program sounds amazing. I definitely love to be a part of that in some way. We've got to do more. We've got to do more.
Donald, just in 30 seconds, if you can, just I'm wrapping up. You have outlined the problem, I think, very well. What's the answer?
I think that you attach it to something along the lines of what Gary was talking about earlier in terms of establishing a pool of money where, not just individual foundations, it's sort of like a gigantic community pool, if you will, similar to what folks in the States and other parts of the diaspora are talking about in terms of reparation. Let's not call it reparations, this is obviously not the same thing, but the idea that you establish a pool of money where different folks throw money into the pot, and then there are folks who have the responsibility of determining how to use that money, whether it be for education or it be for starting businesses or providing more housing or whatever else it is. Something along those lines, but on a more systemic level. That's where I would start.
And finally, Gary and Elaine, you're both here in the UK with me. We don't have any Black billionaires in this country. How long do you think it will be before we do see our first Black billionaire? And this is a kind of side question to that question. Could that actually be a bad thing? Because it could just exemplify further the wealth gap that we have in our community in this country.
I actually want to be a Black billionaire. I want to be one of, so on my WhatsApp status, I'm known as a billionaire mum, and everybody knows me for that, right? But part of me, and I always say to God, but part of me having those billions is to give back. So I'm actually actively working towards building an educational fund for children who can't give. I mean, I think Gary spoke about always hand out. And I think the same as Jamila, we have to stop that mentality. But I want to be able to raise the Black child, raise the Black man, raise the Black woman. And the only way we can do this is that when we get to that level, we bring other people with us, and we have to show them how it's done. If that makes sense, that's how I'm thinking. And that's my prayer every day, that Lord, just give me that money, not so I can show off what I have. I'll make sure I live a very good life with it. However, I want to put down a foundation that lives after me, my children, my great-grandchildren, it leaves a legacy that when it's like that. I always say to people that the name Walker, Madam C.J. Walker, already took the foundation from me, but it's okay. Cunningham Walker is different, and I want that to live. So if you meet somebody now who says my surname is Guinness, that already tells you the kind of leverage in the family that they're from. That's what I want for my family. I want to build a legacy that is there for generations, and it's in the history books, because I want to make a difference to the Black child. For me personally, anyway.
No, I hear it. And just finally, Gary.
You know what? I would absolutely echo everything that Elaine just said, for sure. I think what we look to do in our coaching practice is we look to give the new generation the tools to enable them to transition. Yeah, because I think someone touched on it before, that you get a bright young child, they go to one of the top schools, but they still find themselves in a new space that they don't feel like they belong, Yeah. And it's about giving them those tools that they can effortlessly move through transition and transformational change with ease. So whatever space they find themselves in, they're ready for it, you know. And this whole thing about, Black billionaires in the UK, I think we have some individuals that are definitely pushing that way. Some who are doing some really, really good work. I don't think there is enough collaboration in the UK to make it happen quicker. And I think with more collaboration, that will definitely speed up that whole process. And I think we need to see more of that and take a lot of more from the Americans and the way they do that. I think it will help us to move a lot swifter.
Guys, listen, thank you so much for joining me on our show today. Elaine, Gary, Jamila, and Donald, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you. That was a great chat, and I hope people kind of take away something from that discussion as well. Some nuggets there outlining the problems, but hopefully also some solutions in there as well. Do not forget to follow all of our content across all of our socials, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Check out our website, Blakademik.com. Also our channel, YouTube as well, Blakademik TV. Until next time, look after the people, then. Take care. Peace.